20 years ago, some of the gemstones in this video were sitting in jewelry stores, mineral shows, and dealers' inventories at prices that hardly seem remarkable. Then something changed. A mine stopped producing. A particular color became fashionable. Collectors began competing for material that had once been overlooked. And in a few cases, the supply simply never came back. The result is a strange reversal in the gemstone market. Stones that previous generations could buy without thinking twice can now command hundreds, thousands, sometimes dramatically more, for exceptional specimens. And this isn't simply a list of expensive gems. These are 10 gemstones that used to be surprisingly affordable until rarity, demand, and disappearing supply changed the market around them. Some became expensive gradually, others changed almost overnight. And one of them may be the clearest example of why today's overlooked gemstone can become tomorrow's collector prize. Let's begin with number 10. Number 10, Peridot, the green gem. Everyone thought would stay cheap. There was a time when Peridot was almost too easy to underestimate. Walk through a jewelry store a few decades ago and its bright green color might have caught your eye. But its price rarely commanded the same respect as emerald, sapphire, or ruby. Peridot was beautiful, certainly, but it was also available. Significant production, particularly from Arizona, helped make it one of the more accessible natural green gemstones. For many buyers, that was its appeal. Vivid color without the financial barrier of the great prestige stones. But abundance created an illusion. It made people believe that all Peridot was ordinary. That perception began to change dramatically in the 1990s, when extraordinary crystals emerged from the mountains of Pakistan. Mining at extreme elevations revealed Peridot unlike much of the commercial material buyers had grown accustomed to seeing. Some crystals were remarkably large and transparent, with a rich green color that forced collectors to reconsider what this familiar gemstone was capable of becoming. For a brief period, the discovery created something that gemstone history rarely offers: exceptional material entering the market before its long-term significance was fully understood. Dealers could obtain impressive stones while production was active, and collectors who recognized their quality early were buying into a market that had not yet developed today's appreciation for the finest examples. But gemstones are not manufactured commodities. A mountain cannot be ordered to produce another crystal of the same size, clarity, and color simply because buyers are willing to pay more. As exceptional Pakistani material became better known, demand grew while truly outstanding stones remained difficult to replace. Large size alone wasn't enough. Collectors increasingly wanted the combination: strong natural color, excellent transparency, clean appearance, attractive cutting, and, where documented, desirable provenance. When all of those qualities appeared in one stone, the old assumption that Peridot should always be inexpensive began to collapse. That distinction still matters today. Ordinary commercial Peridot remains accessible, so saying that Peridot became expensive would miss the real story. What changed was the market for the best material. And that may be the more important lesson. Sometimes a gemstone doesn't become valuable because it suddenly becomes rare. It becomes valuable because collectors finally learn which tiny fraction of its supply was rare all along. For years, Peridot's affordability hid its finest treasures in plain sight. By the time the market understood the difference, the easiest opportunity to acquire them had already begun to disappear. Number 9, Spessartine garnet. For much of the 20th century, the word garnet carried a very specific expectation. It meant red, familiar, and relatively affordable. Garnets appeared everywhere, from inexpensive jewelry to antique rings, and that abundance shaped the way people valued the entire family. Then from the dry mountains of Namibia, something appeared that didn't look like the garnet most buyers thought they knew. It was orange, not the dark, brownish orange often associated with ordinary spessartine, but a vivid, saturated color reminiscent of fresh mandarin peel. Some stones seemed almost to glow when light entered them. The material became known in the trade as mandarin garnet, and during the 1990s, exceptional Namibian stones began attracting serious international attention. At first, however, the market had a problem. It didn't quite know what to do with them. They were spectacular, but they were still garnets. And garnet had spent generations carrying the psychological burden of being considered an affordable gemstone. Early buyers could acquire remarkable material at prices that, in hindsight, reflected the reputation of the mineral more than the rarity of the stones themselves. That opportunity did not last. The most celebrated Namibian deposit produced for only a limited period, and as fine material became harder to obtain, collectors began realizing what had been sitting in front of them. Later discoveries in Nigeria and elsewhere brought additional spessartine into the market, but they also made buyers more sophisticated. It was no longer enough for a stone simply to be orange. The finest examples needed exceptional saturation, brightness, transparency, attractive cutting, and enough size to display that unmistakable fiery color. And large stones combining all of those qualities were never common. That changed the economics completely. Ordinary spessartine could remain relatively affordable, while the finest mandarin-colored stones moved into another category, particularly exceptional examples connected to highly regarded sources. The transformation reveals something fascinating about gemstone value. Sometimes the geology doesn't change at all. What changes is our ability to recognize what the geology gave us. Those first vivid orange crystals were already rare when they entered the market. Collectors simply hadn't agreed on how much that rarity was worth yet. By the time they did, much of the easiest supply was already gone, and suddenly a gemstone once held back by the inexpensive reputation of the garnet name had become exactly what early buyers never expected, a collector's prize that was becoming increasingly difficult to replace. Number 8. Aquamarine, the blue gem that became harder to replace. For decades, aquamarine seemed almost immune to scarcity. Brazilian mines produced enormous crystals, jewelry stores displayed pale blue stones in generous sizes, and buyers discovered something unusual in the gemstone world. They could own a large, transparent blue gem without paying anything close to the price of a comparable fine sapphire. Aquamarine became beautiful precisely because it felt attainable. But hidden inside that abundance was a much smaller market that most buyers barely noticed. The problem was color. Much of the aquamarine reaching the market was pale, sometimes so lightly saturated that its blue nearly disappeared under weak lighting. Truly exceptional material was different. It possessed enough depth of color to remain unmistakably blue, while preserving the transparency and brilliance that made aquamarine famous. Brazil produced some legendary examples, and one source would become particularly important: the Santa Maria de Itabira area in Minas Gerais. Fine material associated with the original Santa Maria mine became celebrated for its unusually rich blue appearance. But mines have lifetimes. As exceptional material from famous deposits became increasingly difficult to replace, the name Santa Maria acquired an almost mythical power in the trade. Today, it is also used more broadly in commercial color descriptions, which makes documented origin and proper identification especially important for serious buyers. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Collectors were becoming more selective. A large aquamarine was no longer automatically impressive. Buyers began looking for the difficult combination: strong blue saturation, excellent transparency, attractive cutting, minimal distracting inclusions, and significant size. That changed everything. Aquamarine itself had not suddenly vanished. Commercial material remained available. What became increasingly valuable was the small percentage capable of making someone stop and ask, "Is that really aquamarine?" And that is why comparing an inexpensive aquamarine from decades ago with an exceptional stone today can be misleading. The market did not simply raise the price of the same gemstone. It learned to separate abundance from excellence. Previous generations could look across showcases filled with aquamarine and assume another beautiful stone would always be available. Today's collectors understand that another aquamarine probably will be. Another one with exactly the same color, clarity, size, and character may not. And in the gemstone world, the moment something beautiful becomes difficult to replace is often the moment affordability begins to disappear. Number 7. Spinel. Set into Britain's imperial state crown is a massive red gemstone with a history of kings, battles, and royal succession. For generations, its name suggested exactly what people believed it was, the Black Prince's ruby. Except it isn't a ruby. The famous red stone is a spinel. That single mistake captures almost perfectly what happened to Spinel for centuries. It was beautiful enough to sit beside the world's greatest treasures, yet misunderstood enough that another gemstone often received the credit. And strangely, that misunderstanding eventually created an opportunity for modern collectors. Once gemology became sophisticated enough to distinguish Spinel from ruby reliably, ruby retained centuries of prestige. Spinel had to build a reputation almost from the beginning. During much of the 20th century, that meant remarkable natural red and pink spinels could sometimes be purchased for far less than comparable fine rubies. Not because they lacked beauty, because they lacked recognition. Then the market started correcting itself. Collectors learned that Spinel is a distinct mineral with its own remarkable colors and history. Important sources in Myanmar produce celebrated reds and pinks, while discoveries in Tanzania, Vietnam, and elsewhere revealed vivid material that expanded the gem's identity far beyond being a supposed ruby substitute. Jewelry designers began using Spinel deliberately. Auction houses gave important stones greater visibility. Gemological reports allowed buyers to evaluate origin and characteristics with increasing confidence. And suddenly, the very qualities people had overlooked became desirable. Fine Spinel also carried another advantage. Unlike many rubies on the commercial market, Spinel has historically been valued for frequently reaching buyers without the same expectation of routine heat treatment. But recognition created competition. Exceptional red and vivid pink stones were never available in unlimited quantities. Large examples combining strong saturation, transparency, attractive cutting, and desirable provenance became increasingly difficult to replace. The old bargain began disappearing. That's what makes Spinel's story so unusual. A new mine didn't suddenly make the gemstone famous. The gemstone had already been hiding inside royal history. What changed was that the world finally learned its name. For earlier collectors, misunderstanding kept prices down. For today's collectors, that misunderstanding is gone. And once the market finally gives a rare gemstone the respect it deserves, it rarely gives the old prices back. Number 6. Paraíba tourmaline. Heitor Dimas Barbosa was convinced that something extraordinary was buried beneath the hills of northeastern Brazil. For years, the miner and his team worked through the pegmatites of Paraíba, following a belief that reportedly seemed increasingly difficult to justify. There was no guarantee of a fortune waiting underground, no famous gemstone deposit assuring them they were digging in the right place. Then, near the end of the 1980s, the earth finally answered. What emerged looked almost unnatural. Tourmaline had been known in greens, pinks, reds, and blues for generations, but these crystals seemed to carry their own light. Electric blue, turquoise, blue-green. Even small stones could display a neon intensity that made conventional tourmalines beside them appear almost muted. The cause was eventually linked to copper, sometimes with manganese also influencing the color. But understanding the chemistry didn't solve the real problem. There wasn't much of the finest Brazilian material. When these stones reached the international gem trade, dealers had almost no historical price reference for them. They were new, unfamiliar, and still carried the name tourmaline, a gemstone category with plenty of relatively affordable varieties. Early prices reflected that uncertainty. Then buyers saw the stones. Demand moved faster than supply could ever hope to follow. The original Brazilian workings were limited, difficult to mine, and unable to provide endless quantities of exceptional material. Later discoveries of copper-bearing tourmaline in Nigeria and especially Mozambique expanded the market dramatically, but they did not erase the fascination with the earliest Brazilian stones. Instead, the original discovery became part of their value. Collectors began competing not merely for blue tourmaline, but for exceptional copper-bearing stones with vivid neon color, strong saturation, desirable size, and when properly documented, Brazilian origin. That distinction transformed Paraíba tourmaline from a geological curiosity into one of the modern gem market's most celebrated discoveries. And perhaps the most remarkable part is how quickly it happened. With ruby or emerald, centuries separate early discoveries from today's prices. Paraíba's transformation unfolded within the lifetime of people who remember when the gemstone was new. Some buyers saw an unusual tourmaline and wondered what it should cost. Others recognized that nature might never produce enough of it to answer that question comfortably. The second group understood something the market would learn very quickly. When a gemstone introduces a color the world has never learned how to price, affordability can disappear almost overnight. Number 5. Tanzanite, the one-place gem the world learned to want. If every known commercial source of Tanzanite disappeared tomorrow, miners could not simply move to another country and start again. There is no second major Tanzanite district waiting in Brazil, no equivalent deposit in Sri Lanka, no established alternative in Madagascar. The gemstone's commercial story is tied to one remarkably small area of northern Tanzania, near the foothills of Mount Kilimanjaro. That geographic trap is what makes its rise so extraordinary. Tanzanite entered the modern gemstone world in 1967 when blue-violet crystals were identified from the Marilani area. Soon afterward, Tiffany and Company recognized their commercial potential and promoted the stone under a name far more memorable than blue zoisite, Tanzanite. The timing was almost perfect. Here was a gemstone with the luxurious blue and violet appearance buyers associated with far more established stones, yet without centuries of prestige built into its price. For many jewelry buyers, a substantial Tanzanite offered visual drama that might have required a much larger budget in fine sapphire, and for years enough material reached the market to reinforce the idea that another stone would always be available. But every Tanzanite purchase ultimately depended on the same patch of geology. As the gemstone became internationally recognized, demand expanded far beyond the place capable of producing it. Mining operations moved deeper, production fluctuated, and exceptional rough became increasingly important. The market also learned to distinguish ordinary material from stones with the combination collectors truly wanted: strong blue-violet color, excellent transparency, attractive cutting, and substantial size. This does not mean every Tanzanite has suddenly become rare or expensive. Commercial quality stones remain available, and dramatic claims that the world's supply is about to vanish forever should be treated cautiously. The deeper story is more compelling without exaggeration. Tanzanite has achieved global demand without achieving global supply. Every fine stone still traces its geological existence back to an extraordinarily restricted source. Once exceptional material leaves that source, much of it disappears into jewelry boxes, private collections, and inventories around the world. That makes the old assumption of easy replacement increasingly dangerous. Earlier buyers could see Tanzanite as a beautiful newcomer offering remarkable value. Today's serious collector sees something else as well: a gemstone the entire world learned to desire, from a place nature made only once. And when global demand depends on one small piece of earth, affordable can become a temporary chapter in the story. Number 4. Alexandrite. Imagine inheriting an old ring that nobody in the family considered particularly important. The stone looks green in daylight, perhaps slightly bluish, depending on the angle. Then evening comes. Under warm, incandescent light, the green retreats and something completely different appears. Red, purplish red, sometimes almost raspberry. That transformation is the reason fine Alexandrite has become one of the most elusive prizes in the colored stone world. Its story began in the Russian Ural Mountains in the 19th century, where remarkable color-changing chrysoberyl was discovered and later named Alexandrite. The finest Russian stones established a standard that collectors still chase: attractive green in daylight shifting toward a convincing red under warmer illumination. But the original deposits could not produce indefinitely. As classic Russian material became scarce, Alexandrite increasingly survived in antique jewelry and private collections. Later discoveries in Sri Lanka, Brazil, and parts of Africa brought new stones to market. But they also revealed just how difficult it was to reproduce the combination that had made the finest early material legendary. Because finding Alexandrite is only the beginning. A stone can technically change color and still disappoint. The daylight color may be too brown or gray. The incandescent side may lean heavily purple instead of red. The change may be weak, or the stone may be heavily included. And when good color, strong change, transparency, and meaningful size finally occur together, the number of available stones collapses. That is where the old idea of affordability begins to disappear. Decades ago, buyers were not competing in today's globally connected collector market where laboratory reports, origin research, auction records, and high-resolution images allow exceptional stones to attract attention from across the world. An unusual color-changing ring could once be appreciated mainly as a curiosity. Today, the right Alexandrite can be recognized for exactly what it is. That recognition has transformed the best examples into stones that are extremely difficult to replace. And Alexandrite carries an especially powerful lesson for collectors. Scarcity isn't always obvious when you first look at a gemstone. Sometimes it only becomes visible when you try to find another one. You can search for another Alexandrite. You can find another color-changing stone. But finding one with the same green, the same red, the same clarity, the same size, and the same strength of transformation, that is when you discover what the market learned too late. The truly exceptional ones were never as plentiful as their old prices made them seem. Number 3, Demantoid garnet, the green fire that vanished for generations. In a jewelry box made for the Russian elite, surrounded by gold, enamel, and diamonds, a small green gemstone could once hold its own against almost anything beside it. It wasn't emerald, it was garnet, more specifically, Demantoid, a brilliant green variety of andradite garnet discovered in Russia's Ural Mountains during the 19th century. Its appearance challenged almost everything people expected from the garnet family. Instead of the familiar dark reds, Demantoid could show vivid green accompanied by flashes of spectral fire. Its name came from the idea of being diamond-like, and the comparison wasn't entirely marketing. Demantoid has exceptionally high dispersion, allowing well-cut stones to break light into flashes of color with an intensity unusual among green gems. Russian jewelers recognized its beauty quickly. Demantoid appeared in important jewelry of the late imperial period and became closely associated with creations from workshops such as Fabergé. Then the supply nearly disappeared. Political upheaval and changing mining conditions disrupted production from the classic Russian deposits. For decades, fine Demantoid became far more familiar to collectors through antique jewelry than through newly mined stones. Something that had once been obtainable became a piece of another era. When Russian material eventually returned to the international market and additional deposits were discovered in places including Namibia, buyers had become far more knowledgeable about what separated an ordinary green garnet from an exceptional Demantoid. And one of those differences was hiding inside the stone. Some classic Russian examples contain delicate fibrous inclusions that curve outward like the tail of a horse. In most gemstones, visible inclusions are defects buyers hope to avoid. In Demantoid, a beautiful horsetail can become part of the attraction. It can connect a stone to the geological character collectors associate with historic Russian material, turning what looks like an imperfection into part of its identity. That changed the way the finest stones were judged. Strong green color mattered, fire mattered, size mattered, provenance mattered. And suddenly the most desirable combination existed in quantities far smaller than the simple word garnet suggested. Demantoid never needed to become as famous as emerald. It only needed enough collectors to understand how difficult the best stones were to replace. That is what transformed its market. A gemstone once set into the jewelry of Imperial Russia disappeared long enough for the world to realize what it had lost. And when it returned, the old prices did not return with it. Number 2, Padparadscha sapphire. Place 10 pink-orange sapphires on a table and ask 10 experienced buyers which ones deserve to be called Padparadscha. The answer may not be as simple as you expect, because with this gemstone, enormous value can depend on something remarkably subjective, where pink ends, where orange begins, and whether nature managed to balance the two beautifully enough. The name Padparadscha is traditionally associated with the color of a lotus blossom and has deep connections with Sri Lanka, one of the historic sources of these unusual sapphires. The finest examples occupy a delicate territory between pink and orange, neither color completely dominating the other. For much of the modern gem trade, however, blue sapphire received most of the attention. Unusual pinkish and orangish corundum certainly had admirers, but the global market had not yet developed today's intense appetite for precisely classified rare colors. Then collectors became more sophisticated. Laboratory reports became increasingly important. Treatment status mattered more. Origin could influence desirability. International auctions exposed exceptional colored stones to wealthy buyers far beyond their countries of origin. And Padparadscha became a name people actively hunted. That created an unusual form of scarcity. With many gemstones, the question is whether enough material exists. With Padparadscha, the question is how much material exists inside the tiny window of color that serious buyers will actually accept. Too pink, and the stone may simply be sold as pink sapphire. Too orange, and it can lose the delicate balance collectors expect. Add an unattractive brown modifier, poor saturation, distracting inclusions, or treatments that reduce desirability, and the pool narrows again. Now require good transparency, attractive cutting, meaningful size, and preferably respected laboratory documentation. What looked like a broad category suddenly becomes extraordinarily small. That is why two sapphires of similar weight can occupy completely different worlds of value. The geology created the colors, but collectors created the boundary around perfection. And once the market agreed that only a narrow range deserved one of sapphire's most romantic names, exceptional stones became increasingly difficult to acquire without paying a serious premium. Padparadscha's rise therefore tells us something different from a mine simply running dry. Sometimes an affordable gemstone disappears without disappearing at all. The stones are still there. What vanishes is the chance to buy the rarest color before everyone else learns exactly what to call it. Number 1, natural ruby, the gem people wish they had bought decades ago. Somewhere today, an old ruby is sitting inside a jewelry box exactly where it has been for 40 or 50 years. Its owner may remember what was paid for it. Perhaps it was an anniversary gift, an inheritance, or simply a beautiful stone purchased when fine-colored gems occupied a very different market. The ruby hasn't grown larger, its color hasn't become redder, yet the world around it has changed completely. Ruby was never truly a cheap gemstone. For centuries, exceptional examples have been symbols of wealth and power. But decades ago, buyers operated in a market with fewer international collectors, less sophisticated laboratory testing, and far less competition for the tiny number of stones now considered truly exceptional. Then the market learned to separate ruby into increasingly precise categories: heated or unheated, heavily treated or minimally altered, commercial red or extraordinary saturated color, common provenance or a documented origin associated with one of history's legendary deposits. Those distinctions changed everything. Myanmar, historically known as Burma, produced some of the world's most celebrated rubies, particularly from the Mogok region. Fine stones from this historic source became especially coveted when they combined beautiful red color, strong fluorescence, transparency, desirable size, and evidence of little or no heat treatment. But geology does not produce those qualities on demand. Large ruby crystals may exist, yet much of the material is too included, too dark, too pale, fractured, or requires treatment to reach the appearance consumers expect. Every additional requirement removes another group of stones until the truly exceptional examples become astonishingly scarce. Meanwhile, demand moved in the opposite direction. Collectors became global. Wealth expanded into new markets. Auction houses gave extraordinary rubies international visibility. Gemological laboratories gave buyers greater confidence about treatment and origin. The finest stones were no longer competing for attention inside one jewelry store. They were competing for buyers around the world. That is why ruby belongs at number 1. Not because every natural ruby has become extraordinarily valuable. Many have not. but because the upper end of the market demonstrates almost perfectly what happens when finite geological rarity meets growing human desire. The people who bought exceptional stones decades ago were not buying a different mineral. They were buying into a different world, and that may be the most important lesson in this entire countdown. The greatest gemstone bargains often don't look like bargains when they are available. They only become obvious after the stones become difficult to replace, and everyone wishes they had recognized them sooner. Looking back, the biggest lesson isn't simply that these gemstones became more expensive. It's that many of them were already rare before the market realized it. A mine slowed down, exceptional material became harder to replace. Collectors finally recognized what had been overlooked, and the old prices disappeared. Of course, that doesn't mean every affordable gemstone today will become valuable, but history shows that the finest natural material rarely stays unnoticed forever. So here's the question. Which gemstone do you think is still undervalued today? Tell us in the comments. Because 20 years from now, we may look back at today's prices and wonder why we didn't see it coming.